Hello, everyone. My name is Renee. Thank you for joining me today for another session in the Hacking HR January series, HR Therapy. I want to welcome you all here. Please make sure that you let us know where you're joining us from. Put it in the chat there. It's always great to know where people are joining us from around the world. I hope your day has been great, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or night. In a moment, we're going to be having everybody join us as we have a conversation around creating a culture of compassion, a new era of HR leadership. So at this point, I'm going to ask the lovely Jessa to bring everybody out on stage to join us here. Hello, everyone. I hope your day is going great. It's so awesome to see your faces on the screen here. So our conversation is all around creating cultures of compassion, which I love. I love anything around compassion or joy or happiness or the things that I think we would all like to have more of within our work. So what I'd really like to get started is just for everyone to introduce themselves and what drew you to this conversation about compassion and leadership. So to start off, we'll go clockwise. We'll start with Jeff. If you want to lead us off here, Jeff.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Renee. Thanks, and it's great to be here with everybody. So I'm Jeff Jacobs, and my day job is I'm Senior Director of Organizational Effectiveness at Adobe, which means I'm an internal consultant to our leadership teams. And what drew me here today is that I started down a compassion journey about 3 or 4 years ago which kicked off with the Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And the whole concept of self-compassion was a huge unlock for me in terms of enabling me to be more present, more focused, and more impactful, as opposed to replaying all these things in my head that were not adding value to my day. So great to be with everybody today.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
I'll go next. I'm Halai Chevron, everybody. Great to be here. I'm the VP of Talent and Culture with a digital services firm supporting the federal government called Pluribus Digital, not as well known as Adobe. So that's why I wanted to give a little bit more context there. What drew me to this panel essentially is let's rewind back to 2020 and where we all were. And I think I want to just piggyback on something that Jeff mentioned about self-compassion, understanding personal trials and tribulations or challenges that I had during that time or with my family, allowed me to have a really kind of unique perspective as the head of HR for an organization. Obviously, like many others, went fully remote and actually decided to stay a remote first workplace post, if you can say that, post pandemic. So that's what drew me here. So I'm excited to be here and chat with you all.
Thanks, Halai. Chris.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. My background is I've worked with different companies like Apple and Disney, and now I coach leaders and work with cultures in a company called Bravecore. I've started with some friends, and similar to what Halai and Jeff said, I think there's power in compassion. There's power in empathy. When we think about what are the building blocks of culture or cultures of the future, we can see this in cultures that are successful today, or they're the best places where we love to work and do our best work. It is in those places that we can feel something different, and we feel belonging and connection. And I know for me, personally going through some of my challenges with the pandemic and since then, it means everything, right? What we feel and how we show up and how we connect with others is it's not just what we find in Harvard studies that are 85 years long and tell us, relationships are everything, but it's also true in company cultures. So it's great to be here.
Thanks, Chris. Maya, you want to hit next?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good day. Again, my name is Mai Liu. I am a former head of HR at a cancer care company. I have a bit of an atypical background getting into HR. I'm a recovering accountant by original trade. So still going through that, but it's also given me a good foundation from a finance perspective on how to look at HR from a profit and loss perspective. So we can share more about that as we continue the conversation, but I really was excited about this topic, and specifically around the topic of compassion, because life is hard and we are human, and we are going to bring all these things that are happening in our world to our work, whether or not we are conscious or unconscious about it. And so how we handle that, how do we deal with the stuff that's happening in our lives as humans in the workplace, is a really important topic, not only from an inclusion standpoint, because we want to be able to bring our best selves at work, but also we're not going to be able to do that sometimes with life. These are some of the really key components for creating spaces that are brave and safe for other people. So love this topic from a human perspective, from an inclusion perspective, from a how do we bring out our best selves, and also know that we're not always going to be our best selves because life happens, we're human. So looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Mai. And last but not least, Brandy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I am the Director of Organizational Development and Culture at a Founders Table Restaurant Group. And as an IO psychologist, compassion, is often regarded as, the ability to understand and empathize the experience of others, right? So that holds a very unique position in the realm of IO psychology. And, as leaders, as HR leaders across different organizations and industries, our decisions and our actions really ripple through the professional lives of others. So by integrating compassion into our leadership approach, we open doors to enhance employee well-being and increase job satisfaction and overall improved organizational performance. And those are all the things that I'm very passionate about, and I've really kind of centered on my research in. So it was a no-brainer to be part of this conversation today.
Thanks, Brandy. And thank you all for joining us. And I do want to put the call out in the chat too, that any of the questions that we talk about today, the topics that we're going to be exploring, do feel free to add your own perspectives and insights in the chat and build on what we're discussing, because all of that is really valuable to get the different perspectives. The first question I'm going to ask to the group is really just to get us all on the same page as what we mean when we talk about cultures of compassion or compassionate leadership. So what do we mean when we use those phrases? What does it look like to have a culture of compassion or to be a compassionate leader within today's workplace? And this is come as you are. Take the mic whenever you're ready.
I'm happy to jump in on this, Renee. So when I think about a culture of compassion, first off, compassion is a word that is used constantly, but we seldom, I should say, define it. What does it mean? So I'm glad we're starting by defining terms. And literally, if you go to the origins of the word compassion, it means to struggle with, to suffer with. And I think if we think about a culture through that lens, is how aligned are we when it comes to our goals? When we think about dependency for achieving our goals, do we have goals that are in conflict with one another? Do we have cultures that foster competition or collaboration? So this whole mantra of, if we look at everything through the lens of we've set a goal, we are aligned towards that goal, and we are going to struggle together. We're going to work together through adversity towards that goal, as opposed to being in competition, working in silos, things of that nature. And I can certainly drill into that further, but for me, that's a good starting point.
I'd like to kind of piggyback off of that in the sense that I think part of that unique collective is really recognizing individuals for their collective being, right? They're not just the professional that's there at your company from 9 to 5, but it's their collective selves in terms of personally and professionally, how they come together, how they live their lives, and really uniquely understanding what makes them tick in a good and bad way, and understanding that their entire being is what's brought to work. So everything that you embody as an organization, your values, your principles, is taking into consideration that entire being, the entire human perspective, and not just what they're bringing from 9 to 5, but understanding that everything else contributes to their workday as well.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. It's being kind of seen for who you are, and that we, I think being in those places, we felt it, right? We know when you're in a home or in a with friends that you trust deeply, and a workplace, it can't always be like exactly like a family or friendship, but what it can be is a place where we do feel safe. We feel like we can be brave. We don't have to experience the kind of fear that I think has overrun some workplaces at times, or cultures. I think so. The opportunity to really amplify, compassion, as far as making others the mission, looking for ways to help others and empower them, is really. It's not just I think good for the feelings and for what people overall experience in their lives. It's also great for the future and for what we were trying to build, all of us.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's said. I think, having a culture of compassion in today's workplace it means fostering an environment where empathy, understanding, support, inclusivity, and even psychological safety reign supreme, right? It has to be a guiding principle that shapes all of our interactions, our policies, our practices, and really has to be an integral component in our organizational fabric.
Yeah, I really love that. And I see that in the comments here. Rufina has made a point of saying that living a culture of compassion means prioritizing things like empathy and kindness and understanding in all our interactions. And I love, Brandy, how you pointed out the idea that it's within our systems too, and our processes and our practices that we have in our organizations. I heard one time that compassion is kind of like empathy in action. So you can understand people, and at the same time, you want to help them move forward. And I think in our workplaces, that's all what we want to try to do is, you talked, Jeff, about having that goal, and then how do we move forward together, taking in those, the fact that we are whole human beings when we're at work. And I don't think anyone's going to argue with the idea of wanting that in our workplaces. But sometimes when we're at work, we have to make the business case for things like compassion. And it seems sad to have to make a business case for wanting to treat people well and like human beings, but that is the world that we live in. So what is the business case when it comes to building a culture of compassion?
I can kick off this one to kind of connect the points that Brandy and you mentioned earlier around the role of empathy here. So when we think about experiences and environments where we can feel brave, where we can feel safe, we can bring out the best versions of ourselves. That comes with dual sides where we want to be able to be brave and innovate. We want to be able to take risks and be able to fail and feel that we're not going to be punished or judged or have negative repercussions for doing so. So when we talk about creating cultures of innovation, it has to be dual side to allow for people to bring the things that they want to take risks on, but also an environment that allows for us to not feel we have to be on our best selves all the time and be able to be comfortable being in a bad day and having the safe spaces to say, I'm having a bad day today and I'm not myself, and being able to articulate that safely is, from an individual perspective, one of the business cases for how to have compassion in the workplace and creating those environments where, if we want to innovate, we all also need to have the space for people to have bad days. When we think about cultures from a data perspective, there was a really great study that was done by Gartner around the human deal. So when we think about environments where we excel, we have value associated with how we feel at the workplace. So when we talk about employee value propositions or our employer brand, what is it? Why would someone come work at our organizations? That's called employer brand or a people value proposition strategy. Basing that on how people feel can be a novel concept. Like, why would we use feelings as a basis for if our environment is a place that people want to join? But the ROI here is if 80% or more of people need to feel that their employer sees them as a whole person and not just an employee, the other side of it is less than half of those people feel that their employers see them that way. So there is a bridge between and a gap right now of what's happening in real life in these organizations and what's important to our teammates. And so if we don't address that gap, the retention strategy and the attrition is going to be felt by the organization. And so, we all know that it costs more to have to replace an employee than to spend the money up front and doing an effective onboarding and integration strategy. So from an ROI standpoint, business case, definitely from a retention, inclusion, innovation, a culture of compassion is absolutely critical.
I'd love to jump in on this, Maya. That's a fantastic outline, and I'm glad you brought up innovation, because there are so many situations in which we may say we have a safe environment, but we can't declare the environment to be safe. All we can do is ask our employees to be courageous and to test that, and hopefully we live up to the promise of that. And if we can create that safety, then it is ripe for greater innovation, because we are rewarding risk-taking in that regard. So you mentioned the comments about retention and certainly the value there. I want to share a couple of other things. I'm a fan of the book called The Mind of the Leader, and a study there said over 90% of leaders surveyed stated that compassion was important or extremely important, but the majority said they were unsure as to how to be more compassionate. So I think there's a fascinating opportunity there. And there was also another study that said companies that model compassionate practices outperform the S&P 500 by 14-1. So across the board, there are 6,000 peer-reviewed studies out there that find benefits to collaboration, employee engagement, customer engagement, trust, psychological safety, inclusion, resilience, attraction, retention, all these different things. The biggest challenge that I find is that we live in a world where people will acknowledge this is important, But the struggle is it's seldom urgent, and the urgent will always crowd out the important. And that's the consistent battle that I find on this topic.
Yeah, I think I just agree with everything that Jeff said and what we've been talking about. I think as a leader, we ask ourselves the question, or any leader, what's your real purpose? And it's kind of a mirror test for all leaders. And many of the leaders we've seen, or the kind of leadership that has been popularized over the years or decades, has been very performance focused, very results based, which makes people feel like a kind of a cog in an assembly line, which is not safe, which is not an opportunity to feel brave or even to feel human. And so, I think back on who are the leaders that have had the most impact on me personally in these ways with compassion. I think of one in particular that when I was going through a really difficult time, he found the opportunity to, some leaders would say, well, they'll just meet and just be about the pleasantries, or just how's the work going, right? But he didn't shy away from, making it personal and just being curious. Like, he knew some of the things that were going on in my life, but he also didn't prod or poke, but he just created a space, right, where I could share some things and what was exactly happening in my life. And by opening that floor, we had heart-to-heart experiences, and it reset and helped me, to be successful in my role. And I felt a sense of even love, right, you could say, in the workplace. And that's something that I think when we look at kind of the stoic version of a leader that we've been taught, that is basically a version of what we're seeing with AI. I mean, we look around, like, AI has gotten to where it can replicate and do even a better job of showing empathy than a lot of what doctors are doing. Studies are showing this, right? I don't doubt that it's the same. If we looked at what typical managers or leaders, how they treat people, like, an AI probably could do a better job of, like, showing some feigned empathy. And that's sad to say, but it's a huge opportunity, right? Because if you want to differentiate, but overall just have a real impact as a leader, and all the leaders that we support, it doesn't take a lot, right? It doesn't take much to just be present and to really care, and to ask those kinds of questions that allow people to, share who they are, and to be there for them.
I'm so happy you said that, Chris, because when I think about some of the best leaders that I've had too, they exhibit some of the same qualities or behaviors that you mentioned, whether it was their interactions with you or just in passing. Like, every day you come into the elevator and you say good morning, and then one day you don't. I had a leader once say, "Hey, are you okay?" And I'm like, where's this coming from? And she explained that every morning you are so cheery in the elevator. And so when I think about that and relating it back to kind of what Mai was saying in the beginning in terms of the core KPIs that drive business outcomes, it's those conversations that with your leader that actually uncover some of your intrinsic motivators and values. That in a book that I'm sure all of us have read, Radical Candor by Kim Scott, and exhibiting that type of leadership is really uncovering some of those intrinsic motivators and actually using that as points of feedback, or using that as points in their career journey, or talking to them about, hey, I know you are, and this has been said to me, I know you're first generation American, and stability and growth and development and building your career are very important to you. Let me talk to you about why this opportunity could be great for you. And I loved when my leader said that. And honestly, that made me stay a little bit longer, and probably in an unstable environment, because I knew it was a means to an end in my career journey. So that element of compassion and uncovering some of those things and some of those natural or maybe some informal conversations are definitely what actually enables some of those business outcomes without being able to see it directly.
I mean, I can certainly add, there's been so much that has been said, and I probably will repeat myself. But yeah, there's definitely a compelling business case for cultivating, a culture of compassion, right? There's so many things, enhanced employee engagement, a compassionate workplace fosters a sense of belonging and purpose for all employees. Because when individuals feel cared for and valued, they're more likely to be engaged with their work, which then results in higher productivity, more creativity, like Jeff said, innovation and just overall job satisfaction, right? Which then leads to improved employee retention, right? Organizations that are compassionate and practice compassion tend to retain more talent effectively. Your employees are less likely to look for opportunities elsewhere because they feel that strong sense of connection and appreciation and support where they are. And then, you also just have better mental and physical health, right? And a lot of employees now are starting to tailor their wellness initiatives to more like overall well-being, which encompasses both, right? So a culture of compassion has that direct impact on someone's health and their well-being. There's reduced stress, there's improved mental health, which leads to lower absenteeism, right? Fewer health-related issues, and an overall healthier workforce. And then the list goes on and on. Then you attract more top talent because of the environment that you have and the culture that you have, and there's more collaboration and there's teamwork, and then you just have a positive organizational reputation. That your employer brand increases, and I think also too, it's probably reduced like workplace conflict. There's a lot of conflict that happens at work, a lot of tension. And so compassionate leadership really promotes more effective ways to communicate and try to understand others, because now you can start to address issues with empathy and with care. And then you just have, obviously a more harmonious and collaborative atmosphere. So.
Yeah, I really love all of the points that you made there. I really like, Chris, how you talked about love. I would encourage people to look at the work of Sigal Barasaid. Unfortunately, she passed away, I think last year, but she did extensive research on emotional cultures within organizations. And one type of the emotional culture they studied was companionate love. And companionate love was considered the feelings of affection or caring, compassion, and tenderness that we have for one another. And what they found was that when they studied thousands of employees across various industries as varied as like healthcare to accounting and financial firms, that they found that companionate love led to all those things that Brandy was talking about: increased job satisfaction, commitment to the organization, personal responsibility, people just feeling better about who they were as human beings. So you're right. All of these things have very observable data points that we can point to say that, hey, this isn't just, something that sounds good, but it is something that's integral to actually allowing people to do their best. And when they do their best, it creates better businesses. But whenever we start to get into these things that are considered, I would say, soft, the touchy-feely things, sometimes we get pushback, whether that be from levels above us or even from middle managers or leaders below within the organization. What would you say to, or how would you handle situations where even employees or leaders feel that compassion doesn't really resonate with them? That's not necessary, because we did talk about there a little bit in there that people didn't see it as like a high priority. How would we make sure that we were getting the message across that this wasn't just HR being touchy-feely, but this was something that was integral to the success of the organization?
Yeah, I think there's kind of evidences all around us, stories, as was shared in the chat, I think embodied, right? That people who are living this, it just works better. You could literally observe, a leader in an organization that has compassion and the impact that has on their organization in real time, and just compare that and show. I think of a leader I worked with at Apple. His name's Matthew Costello, runs the entire Beats organization. He was, there was a lot of pressure on him to do a lot of things in his team. I looked at the director and I thought, who's this Andre guy? Oh, that's Dre. So he's on his team. They left when the acquisition happened. Matthew stayed, and all the pressure was on him to run this entire business. And he was going through a lot of personal challenges himself. But it was amazing. What was amazing to see, and you had a lot of egos too, right? Different leaders, in his team. But the thing that made all the difference was him showing up with no ego and inspiring people with compassion, taking the time personally, right? And this was all happening when you had so many other leaders who, somebody's leaving their team, and then suddenly it's like, oh, let's do something to try to keep them, right? If it's a top talent, and then suddenly you have this emergency conversation, right? It's like a dinner, and maybe they save them, maybe they don't. But Matthew was the kind of leader that was having these conversations all the time. And so people just loved working with him. And I think when we look at what works and what doesn't, it's as simple as just observing and seeing this. Another great example I always think of is Microsoft, right? And they just took the lead as far as most valuable company. There's no surprise there in some ways because, prior to Satya, you had a leader who was essentially running the culture into the ground, right? Stack ranking, everybody competing against everybody else, just beating the hell out of the culture. And I'm not going to, name names, but it was a particular CEO prior to Satya. And the thing about Satya was when he came in, he was kind of a quiet force, kind of like a Tim Cook, sitting back. But the curiosity was what is different about him? And he had learned compassion and empathy in a very personal way. His son has cerebral palsy, and his wife, Anu, was very focused on making that the top priority in their family to take care of her son. And it inspired Satya to be a better leader. And this was over years and decades. And so it shows, these are also things and principles that have to be lived over time. But as leaders do, it makes all the difference in the world. And so he was able to hit refresh on that culture, and it's become a culture of humanity and empathy. You can feel it in the products. They're not as clinical as they used to be. It feels like, wow, like Microsoft has some humanity to it, and it really does. But it's really based on, and it's not just a single leader. I think he's created a movement of leaders like him.
Chris, I'd like to double down on, you used a word that I think is just so critical. And I think it's difficult if it's not part of your DNA, but the word you used was curiosity. And I believe that what fosters a powerful, compassionate culture is if your go-to is curiosity versus judgment. And I keep reminding myself of that. There was a Forbes study a few years ago that indicated that 68% of CEOs felt that if they modeled more empathy or vulnerability, they would lose credibility with their employees. Now, that's what we're up against. Now, many of the more enlightened companies don't struggle with those kind of numbers, but still it shows what you're up against when you're using words like that. So the pressure of moving fast and making decisions and whatnot keeps us oftentimes from being curious. I had the good fortune of spending 14 years at Intuit, and the founder of Intuit, Scott Cook, whenever he's speaking in a public arena or one-on-one, I was always struck by the fact that Scott asked more questions of whoever he was talking to than provided answers. Everybody wanted to learn about him, the thought leader behind such an amazing organization, but he was perpetually curious, and as such, a very compassionate individual. So I think that's the challenge, and for leaders to model not only the curiosity, but if they take the first step in being vulnerable, it really goes a long way in creating that safe culture, that safe environment.
Totally agree. Ditto. Double down on everything that's been said so far, Chris and Jeff. I would say from a tactical perspective, if I'm having a conversation one-on-one with an individual who hasn't bought into the touchy-feeliness or the strategy, oftentimes applying the approach of empathy with that person helps. So I'll ask, can you tell me about, let's throw out the touchy-feely stuff. tell me about a situation where you had a leader that you enjoyed working for. What did she or he exhibit? What did they do? What behaviors did you enjoy while working with them? And so as you've put the person into that space of, oh, back when I was, working for a leader, what did I enjoy? Why did I enjoy that? And so having them walk through their thought process and using that as an experience to apply, here's the language of what you felt. That experience where you felt like you were heard, that's compassion. That experience where they took the time to understand more about your life outside of work, that's also compassion. And so sometimes it's just connecting the dots between the language, which sometimes can feel like non-corporate speak, so it doesn't belong in the workplace. It's connecting the dots a little bit around the vocabulary and the behaviors that someone experiences so that they can understand the connection. So that has helped in the past when I'm trying to bridge the gap between someone who hasn't bought into it yet. And if they have experience of like, I've never had someone that I enjoyed working for, part of me breaks my heart a little bit to hear if that's happened in that situation. But then the conversation can evolve to, so what leader would you have, what were the behaviors you might have wished, like what's an example of someone who you've want to work for? What's the type of conversations you'd want to have with that person? And so then it becomes a future that they can build if they haven't had that experience personally. And then it becomes coaching around how to help bring that to life for their team members as well. So that's a tactical technique that I use when I'm talking one-on-one with someone who hasn't bought into the use case for compassion.
Yeah, I love that. I think, a lot of times, a lot of initiatives that seem to come from HR are deemed touchy-feely or unnecessary or not adding to the bottom line, right? But I think when it comes to compassion, as with any other initiative that gets some pushback either from senior leadership or employees, I think the first thing that you should do is just address any misconceptions about it, right? Identify and clarify those misconceptions, those misunderstandings about what a compassionate culture entails, and just really try to connect with that individual about any, shared values and goals, right? Because it'll be easier to show how compassion aligns with the organization's overall mission and values. And kind of reinforce that it's not a departure from our core principles. It's not a departure from how you already want to work and how you want to be treated every day, right? And then also, it's always good to provide more education, right? So whether that's small training sessions on the importance of compassion in the workplace and making sure you're using or, highlighting success stories and you're using, case studies and actual data, because, a lot of senior leadership, especially, I work hand in hand with the CEO and CFO, and they always want to know what the data says, and you want to be able to illustrate what the tangible benefits are to doing something like that and making some type of change. And really, you can just start small. You don't have to do this grand thing and make this huge announcement. You can. A lot of times when we have new ideas on our team, we just pilot small initiatives with different groups. So we might do it in one region or just one specific market or city and try to get some successes and some wins and before implementing it more broadly. And so that tends to work because then people start to talk to one another and then, they do all the talking for us, and then we don't have to really push that hard when we introduce it broadly. So
I think I'm going to touch on something that Brandy and Mike both said. It's about data and encouraging some of those aha moments, which essentially is your qualitative data, right? Like you can run surveys, you can have all the metrics as it relates to termination reasons and exit data. But some of that contextual information is what encourages some of those aha moments. So where I've also seen some success with executives that don't really understand some of the reasoning behind some of these quote unquote touchy-feely HR initiatives is really talking about bottom line impact and talking about some of their high performers or who they would perceive as high performers and ones that we've lost in the last year. And so some of that qualitative data around why they left, what they could have done as a leader and or executive, someone that's not directly tied to that person, to encourage that person to stay. I think that's really helped our business leaders in a multitude of different organizations. I've seen it really kind of understand why, for example, we need to talk about flex programs, why we need to talk about wellness benefits, why we need to talk about encouraging safe spaces or promoting ERGs. These are all things that are sometimes driven by the reactive measures of, we lost this person, or we weren't able to hit our goals in this department. Let's kind of pick that apart a little bit and see and understand the why.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think too that, having a point of view about the culture itself is a great starting point. And, to Halai's point, this could be the rhythm of how we're thinking about or interpreting, right, people's decisions. Sometimes leaders will think, wow, and how many times in HR do we have to have this conversation of, you don't own your people, right? They at some point they're going to leave, right? Whether it's retiring, right, changing jobs, or something else, right? But it's not that you just own them. And I think when we think about what's the contrast between what a culture of compassion being the future oriented, the ideal, what we all want. I think of when we think about toxic cultures or cultures of fear, that's probably the contrast. And as human beings, we all kind of experience this baseline of fear, whether it's conscious or subconscious, and that is not, it's not a great starting point, because then all these other things, and we know that in our daily lives we spend a lot of time at work or doing our work, and so the influence that leaders can have or a culture can have in someone's life is significant. And so how do we break out of that fear and be brave? Well, a lot of cultures have done this, but they limit it by being brave alone, and kind of building silos and looking for answers that are just very expertise oriented or functional of their own. But the real question is, how do we do this and be brave together? And how do leaders look at employees and team members, not as just kind of cogs in the system, but as co-creators? And how do we shape the culture that we really want to build, right, together, and empower each other to do that? And I think data, is a powerful way to help tell the story. And then also having a point of view about what that story is, right? What is that future culture? And, if it's a self, if it's a person, a lot of cultures we look at, like Apple, it's, kind of more matured, maybe it's like got kids, I don't know. Disney's an older culture, it's kind of the grandfather. That was my experience in that one. But, every culture, some are startups and they're kind of getting their legs. Maybe they're, kind of teenage or, a little reckless. And so we had to figure but what are the first principles of building the kind of culture that has compassion built in, and then really live by those principles?
I really love all of that. And I think it's helpful too. Oftentimes we use touchy-feely as it's a bad thing. And I think that when we can build organizations where feelings and emotions aren't seen as unprofessional or unbusinesslike, we can start kind of shedding that the blinders that get put on when we talk about things like compassion, or like you said, Chris, cultures of fear, because people are very much predisposed to do things based upon how they're feeling. There are actions and behaviors that are a result of the feelings that we feel. When people are afraid, That's when they're not taking the risks. That's when they're hiding mistakes. That's when they're not speaking up. So it's really important that we see emotions as actual data, like data that we can use to create better workplaces. And I think that will allow us to create more of these cultures of compassion. We talked a lot about the business case about compassion. We've touched a little bit on how to build it, but as we are now well past the halfway mark in this conversation, just wild, what I'd really like to shift the conversation to is how do we build these type of cultures? What types of steps can we take? Can we help our leaders take? Can we help our employees take to start making these a reality within our organizations?
I'm happy to start if that works. I want to go back to Brandy's keyword in the beginning of the conversation, and that's systems. So systems is the key to creating these cultures, because we can say these words, we can say whatever we want until we run out of air, but until the mechanisms for reward, recognition, and or consequences are reinforced to behaviors that are appropriate or not appropriate in the workforce, behavior change won't stick. It won't happen for the long term and stay. So an example of that is, I think someone mentioned in the comments, are there clear expectations around performance? What is the performance development and management program at these organizations? Are we encouraging people to work based on utilization or number of hours, or something that is what I like to call like machine-oriented KPIs, where people don't operate like machinery? We have to have peak periods of high performance, and there has to be troughs of recharge, rest, recovery, and then come back so that we have a full tank again. So we can't have metrics that continually push our teammates to a place where they're going to run out of energy and run out of fuel. So what are we rewarding people on? Are we rewarding based on metrics that are sustainable in your performance development program? Are we having conversations with our teammates around staying? I love stay conversations. Instead of having the conversation as an exit interview, some of the questions that are asked, why not have it while someone's employed? Why not have those questions around what would help in your experience in staying for another 12 months? What are the areas that you're excited about, and what are the areas you're not excited about with your role? Are there opportunities to tap into those growth areas? Are those areas that bring you excitement in other aspects of the organization? So having those conversations from a growth and development standpoint as part of performance management, rather than when someone's exiting, are opportunities for us to take action or intervene or help them own their career and tap into opportunities before they look elsewhere outside the organization. From a compensation standpoint, are we financially rewarding people around behaviors that are expected? Are we paying people and being clear and transparent about our compensation approach, and having that be from the very beginning when someone joins the organization? Hey, here's our philosophy and strategy for comp. Is this going to work for you? And if not, that's okay. This might not be the place for you. And there's multiple reasons why someone might not be able to accept the comp strategy. And that's okay. It's impossible to be to meet everyone's needs and be able to be in a sustainable business. So it's being transparent about those conversations and the approach before someone joins the organization, so the expectations are crystal clear. So I close with that connection back to the systems and the programs that should reinforce the behaviors. That is going to be what has behaviors stick versus the words and what we say from a people perspective.
I love everything that you said, and you created such a wonderful foundation. And I love that you spent so much time talking about incentives, because whatever we incent, whatever we reward, is the behavior that we're going to get. And there's so many reactions I have to that, but I don't want to forget to highlight one of the comments that was made by Mike, talking about the power of inclusion, because inclusion is so foundational to compassion, to creating that safe environment. So there's so much we could explore on that topic. I did want to share with you a little bit of a case study that we're experiencing here at Adobe. After many years, we revised our company values. And I think we all have experienced or are aware of companies that have values that look nice in a frame, but have no place in how we run the company. And fortunately, we're a pretty values-driven organization. And once we came out with the values, our CEO challenged each of our executives to translate them from the lens of wherever they sat within the organization. So our values are things like create the future, raise the bar, be genuine, things of that nature. And what does that look like from the place of an engineering organization? What does it look like through the lens of human resources or a customer-facing role? And then following on that, we had an initiative that we called Values in Action, where we drilled down a little bit further and said, this is what they look like, and this is what they don't look like. Don't do this, but do this. And to your point, Maya, I take it back to the incentives. Are you rewarding what people do as well as how they do it? And is it proportional? Is it 95% on did you achieve your objectives? And oh, by the way, 5% are were you reasonable to work with? Well, that's not really an incentive that's that's going to change behavior. So I just wanted to reinforce all that, and just another shout out for inclusion that can also be a buzzword unless we operationalize it, drill into it, make it real within our organizations.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. And Lou, I agree with a lot of things that you already said. I mean, a culture of compassion, is characterized by a built-in set of values and behaviors and norms that prioritize the well-being and support and growth of all of its employees, right? So that's with a lot of things that you already said, Maya, especially like with rewards recognition and how we performance manage, that inclusive environment that we create, right, where all voices are heard and respected. It also comes down to, policies that we have, right? So flexible work policies that support flexible working hours or remote work, right? And just promoting that overall healthy work-life balance and respecting boundaries, right? You want employees to feel empowered to set boundaries and not feel like they always have to be available, right? They can have their personal and family time. I think also, destigmatizing mental health. I think making sure that mental health is something that's openly discussed within your organization, and that there are resources and support for employees facing mental health challenges, and being a little bit more proactive with any wellness initiatives that promote well-being through, stress reduction activities and different access to mental health services. I would also even think, when I mentioned it earlier with, conflict resolution, with compassion, right? And I think there really has to be some training around how to address conflict with empathy and focusing on understanding one another's perspectives. And that kind of goes hand in hand with, diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging conversations as well, right? And I think it would be paramount to have resources and processes in place for mediating conflicts in a constructive manner, right? I think there's also room to have practices and programs around self-compassion, and we're, encouraging employees to prioritize self-care, and that there is a recognition of importance of the individual well-being, right? So you don't want employees feeling guilty for taking breaks or using their vacation time and addressing any personal needs and matters that they have. And just overall, just making sure you make sure that the values that you have are compassionate and that they are explicitly articulated in your policies, right? There should be actual clear guidelines for demonstrating compassion in the various aspects of work. It shouldn't just be this word that's always thrown out. You have to break it down and make it tangible and make it real for someone. In my day-to-day, what does compassion look like? So if you even have to have training sessions on how someone might be able to block out their calendar for those moments of self-care and those breaks, or so they can, take a minute to practice mindfulness or things like that, right? Then so be it, right? And I think also too, if I would probably just try to end somewhere, I would just say, in a compassionate culture, all the elements that I mentioned, they really work together to create overall an atmosphere where individuals feel valued, supported, and motivated to do their best. And that's what we all want. So we just have to make sure that it's an actual lived experience for employees when they come into work every day, whether they're coming into an office or they're reporting, to their home desk, right? We just have to make sure that there's a room for them to be able to see it in action and to display it on their own. So
I think just we've talked about, getting business leaders on board, creating a business case, putting the right systems and processes and programs in place once the value is understood as to why there's a need there. And what I see in this shift, and what I actually would prioritize for our organization this year, is really, really investing in our leaders. I think they are the ones that drive the point home. When we think about a cascading communication strategy, they're in the front lines, in the trenches with the employees, and have all of the specific data points around what makes someone successful, what aggravates somebody, what they need to stay at the organization, or what else they need in their career development. And so when I think about leaders and leadership development programs and all of the things that Randy just mentioned in terms of programs and initiatives, is really focusing on not only on rollout and strategy, but specific trainings on how that rollout and strategy applies to leaders and how they can embody those programs or encourage use of programs in one-on-ones or in their team meetings. I just read a SHRM article this morning about how last year's focus for HR was a lot of wellness strategy and wellness programs, and a lot of those programs fell flat. And there's a lot of reasoning as to, why those didn't come through or why they weren't as successful as they were. It's because there weren't a lot of employee feedback or focus groups that were done to understand how that's impacting someone's day to day. And if you do or don't have the resources to do all of those things, just capturing leadership feedback and supporting leadership feedback with supplemental trainings, I think could be something that is not as costly as having kind of the full gamut of HR resources.
Yeah, I just want to add too that we talked about performance management. I think, one of the things that doesn't get as much airtime, we think about just results, like that focus. If relationships are the key to our satisfaction and our happiness over the course of our lives, then why wouldn't we find ways to build relationships into the DNA of everything we're doing in our work? And I've seen this happen. So, for example, Apple has 3 categories of performance, and it's not just results. Results is usually what just gets the airtime, but it's results, innovation, and teamwork. And these are all equally focused, but teamwork especially, I think, is the one. If we think about most companies, it gets ignored, right? Or it's just an afterthought, right? It's like, okay, we got results, but how did this come about? I think the question for us is for leaders, and as we look at cultures of the future, and to Halai's point, is to be very intentional, and to be very intentional about how we're designing these things, and to ask ourselves, well, what really needs to be different? And if all of us have had this existential shift where we're working from home, most of the time, we feel relatively disconnected. There's a mental health crisis that's worse than it was before the pandemic. We can only imagine how it feels for most people. And so how much intention does that require to really create momentum around relationships and connection? well, it's going to take far more. And all of the mechanisms that we have in place, we've got to build that into what we're doing. And I think when we see teams and people working in those ways as as a brain trust. And if you come back and you feel that kind of dynamic in a team, that's usually where it happens, right? You're having brave conversations, you're sharing, it's kind of building blocks around the table. That's a different feeling. And most people, when they've had that, they don't want to leave, those places. And I think figuring how we can inspire people to have those moments is going to matter a lot for the future.
I like how you talked there, Chris, about using the measurements to make sure that we're hitting the right marks. So even around the relationships, are people making the relationships? And to the point, Brandy, how you said about how the wellness programs are falling flat because we're not getting input from employees beforehand. So one of the things that's important when we're building cultures of compassion is making sure that we're measuring the success that we're having in the initiatives that we're putting forth, so that it doesn't come off as another one of these just feel good programs that we do, and it's not actually having the impact that we want. So I know we only have a couple minutes left here, but how do you measure success in this type of a culture? How do we know that we're hitting the right points when we're going about building it? This is a tough one for the end.
I always hate silence, so I'll fill the void. So I would say that I'll go out on a limb and say dramatically that there is no way to explicitly measure compassion as an output metric, but compassion serves as an input metric that influences employee engagement and retention and innovation and all the things that we talked about today. So that's part of the challenge. Is if it's absent, I believe we will see a dramatic impact on those output metrics. However, to measure it by itself and prove its value by itself, we go back to those scientific studies and the undeniable connection to a lot of the things that were shared by the people on the panel today.
Yeah, I think there is quantitative and qualitative indicators that kind of reflect the impact of compassion and any compassion initiatives. So as Jeff mentioned, overall, your employee engagement surveys are going to reveal the success of any implementation that you've had, specifically questions related to well-being or trust in leadership and perceived organizational support, right? As well as any open-ended feedback that an employee might leave. I think it's also going to be seen in retention rates, right? You can track changes in employee turnover rates over time from the time you implemented those compassionate initiatives. Analyze those retention rates amongst high performers and even diverse employees, right, to really start to see the impact. I think it's also going to be in performance metrics. You look at team and individual productivity and those KPIs that are, that are aligned with the organizational goals. I think you can look at absenteeism and sick leave usage, right, and monitor those trends and assess any correlation between those compassion initiatives and reduced stress-related absences. And if you want to do a survey on well-being and mental health, you could certainly do that as well. And then ask those, pointed questions to explore any qualitative responses to gain deeper insights into an employee's overall mental health experience at work. And, and then even, with recognition and award programs, I think, you can probably gather, anecdotal stories related to recognized acts of compassion, right? And share those in a town hall setting or like an employee spotlight or something like that. And I think it could even be seen in any of your diversity and inclusion metrics. If you're an organization that measures those or keeps track of those, you can assess representation, inclusion in leadership positions and changes in workforce diversity and, conduct focus groups, explore employees' experiences, right? So it's many opportunities to kind of measure how successful it's been.
Those are great suggestions, Brandy and Jeff. Thank you. I hate to cut off this conversation because I really think that we could have probably hour talking about this and digging into it even further. But I do know that there's, I'm choppy. I do know that there's another panel coming up to talk about empathetic HR leaders. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Such great insights, suggestions, things that people are going to be able to try and maybe take away a different perspective about what compassion in the workplace looks like and how to build more cultures of compassion within their organization. Thank you, everybody, for contributing in the comment section and providing your own insights on this discussion. Thank you, Jeff, Halai, Chris, Mai, and Brandy for joining me today. And hopefully everybody has an excellent rest of their day.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Hello everyone, can you hear me now? Just say that I can hear you or not. Hello? Oh, I unmuted myself. Does it work now? Can you hear me? Hello? Okay, so it looks like you can hear me. Well, apologies. It happens every now and again. I hope I can get some empathy and we can start off this panel already deep in the topic. I was just welcoming everybody. I was welcoming back those who just rolled over from the previous conversation. This is panel 2 of the day 8, and we will be talking about the empathetic HR leader. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, and because I already took up a couple of minutes being on mute and saying amazing things, I will ask Jessa to just bring the speakers up on the stage, and we will try to make the most out of the time that we have left. So thank you so very much for the space and the grace with me being human and technology challenged. I guess it happens to the best of us. Now, the empathetic HR leader, and more importantly, we will be talking about understanding and responding to HR challenges. I do want to just repeat that this is the space of HR for HR. So whatever it is that we are discussing, it's always encouraged. Just bring the conversation and ground the conversation in how it is specific to HR. Now, what we will do, I will pass the e-mic around as you appear on my screen clockwise. And the first ask is very, very simple. Please kindly, shortly introduce yourselves. And also, I am curious, when you hear empathetic HR leader, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? It can be a word, it can be a key characteristic, it can be a short personal story that brings this empathetic HR leader expression to life. Deborah, a joy to see you again. Welcome. We can't hear you. I don't know if it's just me, but you sound like cartoons speaking very, very quickly. Yes, still. Okay, let's go to Sarika, and then we will look back into you. It looks like we have a theme for the day. Sarika, good to see you again. It's been 24 hours?
Yeah, it's good to see you too, twice in a week. I love it. Thank you again for having me. My name is Sarika Lamont. I am the Vice President of People for a company called Vidyard, which is based out of Canada. We are a go-to-market video-based product. I'm super excited to be here talking about empathy in HR leadership. When I think about empathy, and if I were to equate it into the first word that comes to mind, it's human, right? It's just actually perfect situation that happened. You were on mute, couldn't hear you. And your first thing was, I'm human. We all make mistakes. Here we are. Like, that's exactly what I think of when I think of empathy or someone showing another individual empathy.
Thank you so very much. Carol, good to see you. It's been a minute since we shared a conversation.
It has been. Thank you, Manola. Glad to be here. My name is Carol Cooley. I'm the former SVP of Human Resources for Pacific Western Bank. When I think about empathy and, again, kind of grounding it in the HR for HR space, one of the things that I think about most frequently is creating a safe space for HR professionals to be able to come together, whether that's on your team in the work environment or with your network. Oftentimes we're here to support the rest of the organization, and we're the place where everybody else comes to with their issues and problems. And I find it very, very important when thinking about HR for HR to create that safe space where the HR folks can come together, they can laugh, they can joke around, they can share their problems, and feel like there's a trusted team of people around them to be able to help support them as they support the rest of the organization.
How wonderful. And while we give Deborah a couple of extra seconds and see if she can jump right back in, I would be very, very curious to hear from the people in the audience. When you do hear about empathetic HR leader, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And even more so, is there a leader that comes to your mind that you would say, yes, that is someone that embodies being an empathetic leader? Also, what I didn't well, I did say, but I was muted. So please consider the chat and the comments your own conversation space, and drop your comments, drop your questions, and even drop your insights and your own stories. We always learn so much from interacting with our audience. Before we jump very, very deep into the topic, I was curious to ask you, as you look around in your own environment and within your own HR communities, what are some of the challenges that you are faced with at the moment, and also what are some of the challenges that you believe will continue in the future or come up? And if it's okay, let's just park answering this for one moment. We go agile, not fragile. Let's welcome Deborah back into the conversation. So short intro, empathetic HR leader.
Thanks, Manola. Can you hear me better now?
Wonderful.
Great.
Wonderful.
See, everybody's having problems today, so hopefully everybody has empathy for us. So Deborah Maynard, I'm the CHRO of Coast Mental Health here in British Columbia. And for me, when I hear empathetic leader, I hear someone who understands that people don't bring just their work self to the workplace, they bring their whole self to the workplace, and recognizing that us as leaders need to understand and support that, because this is how we get the best out of our staff and ourselves, is really being true to ourselves and true to our own stories and who we are in the workplace.
Wonderful. Now, jumping into HR challenges, what are some of the most pressing HR challenges that you're encountered with at the moment, and what do you see moving forward? And what I will do, I will just ask Carol to be the pioneer on this one, and then Sarika, Deborah, just build your own conversation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are definitely so many challenges out there in the workplace. One of it is just kind of the speed of change of what's happening. Organizations really have to keep up with the pace of change in order to continue to be a going concern and consideration. And with that comes a lot of uncertainty in the workplace with employees. So whether it's financial uncertainty about, recession, or, the company's financial performance, what does that mean to me? Am I going to have a job? Are the layoffs that are impacting so many tech companies? It hit us very hard in the banking industry. What are some of those things that are going to basically keep people up at night? And that's just on the work side of things. As Deborah mentioned, people are bringing their own personal concerns and considerations about their home life, their family life, mental health challenges. And so I think it's even more incumbent upon HR professionals to understand kind of the full spectrum of challenges that are out there and potentially impacting employees, and create an environment where you can listen to what those challenges are and address it in more of instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, it's more of a one-size-fits-one. You really need to understand what's at the heart of employees' concerns to be able to support them effectively. And think about that from the HR for HR perspective, which is you then have to take care of the people who are taking care of the rest of the organization. So it's kind of a challenge within a challenge, as I like to say.
Carol, I was going to build off of something that you just said that resonated, where it's now not just a one-to-many. In some cases, it's a one-for-one, right? You have to think about the different employees that you have inside of your organization, which is really a challenge right now, because the first time in our working history, we have 5 generations that sit inside of our workforce, and they all desire and command something different. So that's posing obviously a lot of extra challenges on HR and people teams, because ultimately we are always on the forefront of designing for the employee experience and ways to think about how we engage and connect with different types of employees who desire different things, and they're in different places in their life. I happen to be in the tech industry, and unfortunately, we ourselves have had to go through some really tough decisions over the last year in terms of layoffs. And so a real challenge I know I'm faced with my team right now is we've had to do layoffs. which creates, to your point, Carol, a lot even greater uncertainty, job uncertainty, financial uncertainty, all the things. And then we're also equally trying to figure out, how do we continue to keep the people that are still with us engaged? How do we get them to trust in us and to trust in leadership? How do we better connect? How do we connect? And we're also a remote first organization. So we're very distributed across primarily North America at this point, and primarily in Canada. I'm in the US, and so poses my own challenge because the company is based in Canada. And so it's trying to also understand, how can I and my team and the leaders around me better connect the community of people we have in our organization, so that they do feel a sense of belonging. They do feel this pride to come into work every day. They do feel this connection with the people that they're working with, to help, at least alleviate some of the uncertainty that they're having. And so we're just constantly thinking about how we consider to design for those experiences, but it's just so challenging because we have less resources as a result of layoffs and as a result of the financial uncertainty going on inside of organizations. And so we're just constantly thinking about, how can we drive higher engagement? How can we bring people together and connect? And then I have to also be concerned with not burning out my own team. And how do I make sure that I'm empowering my team and also supporting my team from their own level of burnout while they care about the employees' burnout? So this has probably been, I would say, the toughest time to be in the people in HR space, riddled with a lot of challenges. And so, to the point of the topic today, I think empathy is of paramount importance, and it's not just for HR leaders. It's for everyone. I think all leaders, and I also think employees. I believe employees need to give us a little bit of empathy as well, because we're trying. And I mean, we are trying. And it's just so hard when it doesn't feel like it's really making any inroads, because, we're in the middle of our own engagement survey right now. And no matter how much we're trying, we're seeing the engagement come in and people are like, oh, well, I still don't feel engaged and I don't understand our culture. And it's like, oh my gosh, we're trying.
Yeah, so many layers to unpack there, and we will come back and pick them one by one. Deborah, what would you like to add to this one?
Sarika, you totally nailed it for me, is when you talked about the different generations and their needs and how you have to, manage and support them. And I think, what resonates for me as a, HR, having an empathetic HR leader, and really is that empathy for our own team, because they're people. Some of the things they have to deal with on a daily basis can be quite horrific, and it's not just the employees. And it seems that everybody has higher expectations for HR than they've ever had before, and people are really, and I know my video, I'm sorry about that, but my video is not working well, but we have higher expectations. That we'll fix the problems, that we'll sort the issues, that we'll have a program or something. And people aren't wanting to take as much personal accountability for their own employment. And therefore, we find that comes out in different ways and impacts the way that HR people themselves are viewing the issues that they're dealing with, because they're not receiving any of the empathy back, from some of the managers and things. So I think it's very challenging. And really, to me, it's about listening and, letting them, vent when they need to vent, and, really being just there to support that and understand, say, hey, I understand how you feel. I've been there. This is how I handle that sort of thing, and really have those conversations with our teams, because the expectations are higher than they've ever been. And I think that's all I'll add.
My next question is a combination of two things. An idea that I just had listening to the first round of introductions. And I also read Rosie McLaughlin's comment with the biggest difficulty in HR's mandate in this new world of work, where it's balancing this being empathetic, well-being, engagement, creating an atmosphere of psychological safety, while getting a seat at the table and maintaining a seat at the table still comes with the expectation that it's organizational efficiency, numbers, metrics, all those delivered within a wider context of uncertainty, raging change, and everything happening at the same time, plus She also mentioned the constant social media pressure. Now, here's the question. In what ways, if any, an empathetic HR leader is different than another whatever function empathetic leader? Also, keeping in mind the lenses of all these that we just summarized from Rosie's comment. Sarika, would you like to lead us into this?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. You asked, in what ways is an empathetic HR leader different than maybe a leader in another function?
Exactly.
That's a great question. I mean, I think between you and Rosie, you sort of nailed it. Like, this expectation, our sort of oversight and our purview is much more wide ranging, and we think about all of the employees and all of their experiences. And you have different personas inside of an organization, similar to talking about the different generations. And so they all require something different. And as an HR leader, our ability to be an empathetic leader is to be able to reach in and really seek to listen to learn. But we're having to do that across a much wider spectrum and many more employees than maybe, a leader of product is focused on their particular team, right? And so they have a subset of individuals, whereas we have to think about, okay, how do we design the experience? How do we empathetically design an experience for one to many, one to some, and one to one? And so in that way, I feel like that's how an HR leader has to be different. We also need to be incredibly impartial. We need to be unbiased. And so we're, really having to dig in there with each individual employee to really understand where they're coming from, where their perspective is. And I think that makes it a lot more challenging. We deal with a lot more employees on any given basis. We deal with the good, we deal with the bad, we deal with the pretty and the ugly. And so our empathy, our batteries, our empathy gets tested quite a bit, right? Because we have to be, I believe HR leaders have to be that much more resilient as a result of a lot of the things that I just mentioned. Our resilience levels and our patience levels have to be way higher. And we have to be on our game, I believe, all the time. I feel like in a lot of cases, and I feel like this even as a leader, which is why I love the communities that I've built around me of other HR leaders, because I don't feel like I have the ability to have a bad day inside of our organization, because a lot of people are looking to the HR leader. They're looking to set the tone from the top. They're looking for us to be the positive influence and bring the positive momentum into the organization. Because if you're sitting at the top as an HR leader, if you get frustrated, right, then everyone's going to start. It's going to create a lot of anxiety for individuals inside of an organization. And so I find our role to be incredibly complex. I see Carol and Deborah both nodding along, so I imagine they're obviously feeling a lot of the same feelings. So I'd love to hear from my colleagues as well, where they might agree or disagree.
Hi, can I comment on that? I agree with so much that you said. And, the other piece that I would add is that as HR leaders, our perspective includes how an individual situation is actually going to impact other employees. So the difference for us is the product manager can say, oh, that employee is having this day and I'd like to pay her. And we have to say, well, what's the impact of that going to be across the organization? And so, balancing that empathy and supporting them, and then really understanding how what we do has a broad impact across the organization. And I think that is, particularly important. I would say that I believe that although you can't have a bad day, we have to be open, and maybe show our feelings, because I think that's one of the things that HR, sometimes is you have no feeling. It's okay, well, and I think I'm upfront and say, hey, look, I'll say to my team or to a manager, hey, look, I'm not having my best day. It's not you. I apologize. But, and I think that there's a lot of actually respect for the fact that, you can be open and demonstrate those leadership and empathetic skills with others and show that you're vulnerable. So I would say that, yes, you can't have a bad day, but I think there's also being, true, you're not going to, about how you approach it, because I think it's very important from employee perspective, to know that their HR team is human, and that they have feelings. And, yes, we're not going to, perhaps behave as, others do. But I think that there's a balance there for us that we need to, if you want to be shown that you're empathetic and you want to be shown that you have employees' best interests, sometimes you have to show that you're human too, and have those feelings, and it hurts you to have to deal with that issue as much as it does managers. So that's from my perspective, I would just add that little piece in.
No, I just to quickly comment to that, Deborah, you're totally spot on. I think vulnerability is such an important ingredient to true leader and to an authentic leadership. My point, and it's hard to show that you have a bad day. I feel like I can do that with my team or those in like smaller, intimate settings. It's harder to do that if you're just much more mindful of doing that when there's a larger group and you can't provide any sort of context. Like that intimacy and that trust building with someone is so important, so that they recognize also like this isn't just like a leader that's like has bad days all the time and they're like, losing their mind. But I do absolutely agree with you. That level of vulnerability is so important to the authenticity.
All things at the right time, right?
Yeah. Totally. It's a balance for sure.
Yeah, for me, balance is a really key point. And I want to get back to something that Deborah mentioned about, the organization, the impact of, maybe making a decision for one person that might have broader implications across the organization. One of the things that we haven't touched on, to me, that's incumbent upon an HR leader is the level of influence within the organization. So, I've come from organizations where we've had multiple business units, and each one has a little bit of kind of their own culture and a lot of their own history. And I think it's incumbent upon me as an HR leader to understand kind of that history and culture for each of the business units, but be able to influence effectively and coach leaders effectively around the implications of maybe making a decision for one or a few people that might have broader implications across, what we're thinking about for equity or diversity or compensation across the rest of the organization. So again, I think it's just another point to be made about the difference between the HR leader and a leader in another area is we're watching out for the organization as a whole, and also having to balance representing all of the individual constituents within that organization. So there's just a different, I think, level of complexity. And we're oftentimes looked to be that bellwether of what the organization is feeling, and yet having to balance so many different constituents all along the way. There's just a higher level of complexity in terms of the impact that some of the decisions around people can have within an organization. And you can quickly, when you're making decisions about people, run into unintended consequences if you're not careful and thinking it through.
I was listening to this conversation, and bits and pieces of some previous panels came to mind, especially bits and pieces around empathy fatigue and compassion fatigue, and around I think someone referred to it as vicarious trauma. But also, I was reminded of a recent conversation, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, on how when we are in HR doing HR work, that oftentimes comes with confidentiality, with sensitive information, with boundaries that no matter how compassionate, empathetic, psychologically safe we feel in a conversation, it's just not the time, not the place, and not the right thing to do to just put it all out in the open. So it's quite a tight balance to navigate between all these elements. So I was wondering, when you are in situations where you might feel overwhelmed or tired, or just this day feels just infinite, what are some of the things that you do, something very practical, that people can find inspiration in and validation, and maybe just that extra bit of sanity that will make them go safely through the day. What would you like to share? I see smiles, so that's already changing the energy of the question a
Yeah.
little bit. Deborah, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, can I just add one thing? I think one thing that I do and is I remind myself that even though I may have heard this story from 150 different employees, this is the first time that employee is sharing that story. So I try to, you know, match my energy to the fact that this is their first time saying it, even though I know what the outcome is and I know what I'm going to say. It's like listening. And when I run out of energy, I just go look at my dog and enjoy a little bit of puppy time, throwing the ball and the toys in the house, because how can you not be energized by your dog just like being so happy and excited to see you, even if everybody else in the world isn't. You're the dog's person, right? So I know that may not be, as practical as some other people's ideas, but like I work at home, so I just go out there and my dog just, the tail's a wagon and I'm his person, right? So, that's one thing I'd say I do practically. Yeah.
Deborah, that's so funny. As you're saying that, my dog is laying right here. So I do the exact same thing, where I just if I'm having a moment, I'm going to look at my dog, or I'm going to crouch down and lay with him, pet him. So I definitely do the same thing. And I find that there's definitely a calming presence, so much so that we're getting a puppy on Friday to just bring in a little bit more of that positive energy into the house. But we're also crazy because there's so much going on. Right. I think another thing that I do, and in pure vulnerability, because that's what we're here for, is I have a therapist that I talk to every other week. And one of the main things that we really, really do a lot is how do I manage my emotions, especially when I'm overwhelmed and there's so much going on in life with, young kids at home and working from home and feeling a little bit isolated and then having a big job, is finding my time to be in the present. And so I try really hard in the morning to get up when I can, early, and even spending 3 to 5 minutes of some type of meditation and just setting my intention for the day. But I also find when I'm in the moment in my office and dealing with something challenging, that's generally the time where I feel like I need to find something to really ground me. I have different things on my desk, like stress balls, like little fidgets. My son is the same way. And I tend to grab a hold of something, whether it's the fidget or even having my hands on, or putting my hands on my legs, because then that just reminds me that I'm in my present moment and I'm trying to ground myself. And so that generally helps me to sort of come to and snap out of the moment that I'm in. I also have learned if I'm having a bad day and, I'm starting my day and I'm things just seemingly build on each other, I have taken it a point to just pause. And I might tell folks, especially on my team where I have more control of my calendar, I will tell my team hey, you know what? I can't join this meeting today. I'm going to reschedule. I'm having a day. And I just need a break. And so in that moment, I don't want to show up. I don't want to show up in a negative way sometimes in a meeting, especially if it's a one-on-one or it's a larger team meeting. And so kind of to the point Deborah made about showing your vulnerability, I just say it like it is. And at those points, I'll step outside, I'll get a breath of fresh air, I'll take a 5 to 10 minute walk, right? I'll find times to sort of break up the day and step away from the computer. And for me, I found that those couple of things that I've introduced into sort of my day-to-day have definitely helped me. So definitely some ideas that have worked with me that I've worked on with my own personal therapist.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Carol.
Yeah, good luck on the new dog. I have 2. So when they were younger and trying to get them to behave, oh boy, puppies are something fun. But in addition to kind of what has already been mentioned, I would say one of the things that was suggested to me by a coach and a mentor a while ago was to put together a little bit of a brag book. So if you have thank you notes or emails or just things that really resonate with you, accomplishments that you've had, print them out, put them in a folder, have them nearby. so that when you're going through those moments of stress, you can remember some of those accomplishments that may not come immediately to mind. Or to me, it's always about, oh yeah, reminding myself that I have made a difference. And to me, that feeds kind of my positivity and how I felt that I can contribute to the organization. So that's another thing that I do in addition to the stress balls and the dog conversations and just getting outside and having a little bit of sunshine. I am lucky to live in the Denver metro area, and we have 300 days of sunshine a year. So I pop outside as often as I can to take advantage of that.
This is absolutely wonderful. And just as a special thank you for showing up with your own stories, just a quick personal build on everything that you shared. So, Deborah, since you were the first one to bring up dogs, or let's be inclusive, pets, I did write an article a while back, what dog sitting taught me about change management, because I do change work for a living. And one of the things that I learned from the most adorable 2 French bulldogs in the world was to be mindful with an L and not mindful with double L. So that was the first one. And then Sarika, also inspiration from going through therapy. I remember I got an assignment once from my therapist, go home and make a list of all the things that give you joy. And I made a list. I was a recovering corporate consultant back then, and I almost put together an Excel pivot, I went back and I talked for 40 minutes uninterrupted. That should have been the red flag. And then at the end, she asked me, how long does this list need to get before you list yourself? And I actually took that question and I use it in all my stakeholder analysis and mapping interventions with the teams that I work with. I'm like, okay, so who are your stakeholders? And then I let them work. And then I'm like, okay, how long does this list need to get before you list your own selves? How do you pick yourselves up? And then Carol, back to your point, I don't have a brag book, but I do have a folder on my laptop, and it's called Smiles for When You Need Them. And that's where I save all the good things that happen on good days. Now, I was wondering, how can we help people in the audience who are navigating workplace environments where this culture of empathy sounds like yet another HR thingy? So who and what roles hold what accountabilities for building a culture of empathy? How can we make this an organizational movement, not an HR mandate? Who would like to lead this one? Deborah.
Sure, I'll go first. For me, everybody is responsible for creating the culture. It's not an HR thing. All too often, it's like, we're the fun people and we have to do all these different things. But I think creating a culture of empathy is something that starts at the top and has a groundswell from the bottom. I've worked in, cultures where, it's not good to show those emotions, but over time, if you talk to different people and they really understand how that can assist the organization in becoming better and driving better results, you can get that support internally and build it. But it's not, I can be an advocate and I can try to help facilitate it, but it has to be from everybody. And hopefully you can get your CEO to buy in, because if it shows from the top here, it's going to be everywhere. But I think groundswells can make a difference to that, because, I've seen how a group of very dedicated employees can make, fairly big changes in their organizations by just helping, drive that. And, you can see that. So that, I think it's everybody's responsibility.
Carol.
I think, to add on to what Deborah said, I think where HR can really help is going back to thinking about the listening aspects of it. I think that's really important in creating a culture where there's a lot of empathy, is helping your probably most senior leaders and your frontline managers create this culture of being receptive to listening to what's out there. and what employees are thinking and feeling and how they're showing up, and even asking questions when things just don't seem quite right, but people are trying to muscle through anyways. So I think that that's where HR can really help support that culture of empathy and in setting the groundwork for being the person and being the team that's going to be receptive to listening, help managers and leaders be more receptive to listening. Because as we talked about earlier, I think Sarika made this point where, there are people coming from a variety of different generations, from a variety of different backgrounds and experiences. And to me, one of the most dangerous things in an organization is when people continue to make assumptions. And I often have to check myself on that. I think it's really incumbent to create that good organizational culture where you've built trust, you've built the ability to listen and have authentic two-way communication. And that sets that groundwork and that foundation. And that's where I think HR can have an additive role, maybe above and apart from where other leaders and other functions may not have as much skin in the game.
Yeah, I agree with both Deborah and Carol's comments here. And I do believe groundswell is the best way. Everybody, right, has a part to play in that. But I do believe that there is a responsibility from the senior most leaders in an organization to model those behaviors, right? I mean, they have to pave the way. They have to model it in such a way that people feel psychologically safe to be vulnerable and empathetic. If they're not showing up in that way, it's going to be very difficult for, as a cascading effect, for their leaders to feel like it's a comfortable thing to do. And for those leaders and their, right, it works its way down. And so while everybody needs to be able to show up in that way, senior leaders need to make sure that it's acceptable, and that's something that they value inside of their organization. And I'll tell you, too often that is not the case, and makes it very, very difficult. But for sure, in Carol's point, there's a lot we can do to be additive to that and to help drive accountability there. And especially, for senior HR leaders who do have a seat at the table and have that very strong partnership up top, I think there's a lot that we can do to make sure that we hold our senior most leaders, starting with the CEO, the most accountable to showing up in that way.
I hope I remember correctly. Quite early on into our conversation, there was a question, and that, I must say, is a recurrent question throughout our January series. And that was something along the lines, can empathy be learned? And whenever we brought this question into the panel, there was full agreement on the fact that empathy is something that is innate. We are born with it. It's more something along the lines, how can we harness it in its natural expression to serve the purpose of our roles within the organization? Now, my next question to all of you is, how would you what would you advise, what would you recommend, either people who are very early on in their careers or people who are repositioning their careers within HR? How can they best harness empathy for an HR career?
Manola, I just wanted to comment on that because I've had that question asked before in different forums on can empathy be learned? While I do believe there are people for sure that just innately have that quality and have that understanding, and maybe, more emotionally intuitive, whatever that might be, I do believe that some level of empathy can be learned and appreciated. I think it fundamentally comes from developing skills like active listening, right? Effective communication skills, understanding what emotional intelligence is and what those behaviors mean to showcase and demonstrate emotional intelligence, understanding another person's perspective, being able to put yourselves in someone else's shoes. I fundamentally believe those are all foundational elements to ultimately demonstrating your ability to be empathetic. And so I think it takes practice. I think it takes conscious and intentional effort and this sort of continuous loop of reflection and self-reflection. And, for any of us to let our egos go, I think I am an incredibly empathetic person. However, I do know there are definitely cases and times where I might not show up as empathetic, right? And that could be because of my ego getting in the way. That could be, it's triggering. It could be a whole host of reasons. And so I guess that also sort of answers the question, someone that's early on in their career or someone that's trying to pivot into a career in HR and really wants to understand how to be more empathetic. To me, active listening, understanding emotional intelligence, there are a lot of, EI and EQ courses out there now, and effective communication skills, I think will definitely get you down the path of learning the art and the behaviors that you can demonstrate to show that you're an empathetic individual.
Yeah, I agree, Sarika. I think there's a lot of focus on the EQ types of behaviors. There's a lot of skill building available on the softer skills side of things. And I think while someone moving into an HR career or really trying to pivot into that may focus more on the nuts and bolts, I think for me, one of the biggest lessons learned earlier on in my career is really that there's kind of at least two sides to every story. So if you think about employee relations issues and you're talking to different people, there is often not one absolute truth, because people are bringing their own biases, their values, their personal experiences, and they may view the exact same situation slightly different or very differently from somebody else who was a part of that same situation. So I learned that early on in my career and focusing a lot on employee relations issues that really, the stories vary based on the individual's perspective and involvement in that. And if you want to nail down and put a pin in an absolute truth, HR is probably not the career for you, because it's all about navigating the shades of gray. And to me, that can be a really strong basis for developing empathy, is really not just necessarily understanding that the two stories are different, but behind that is people's perspectives and values and where they're coming from are also different. And to me, that triggers the foundations of being more of an empathetic leader.
I would agree. I mean, so much of what you said, the two of you, resonated with me. And I would say, as a young person, when I entered the workforce, I think I had a difficulty balancing what the organization needs were and what I thought being empathetic meant. And what I would say is, you still, no matter what, you still need to do the right thing for the organization. But it's about how you approach it and how you do it that matters. And if as you're entering a career in HR, you're not going to be the nice person all the time. People aren't going to like you all the time, and you have to reconcile that with yourself and know that yes, you care, but sometimes even though you care, the right thing to do is actually to move that person along in the organization. So, for me, it's, if I had to give a piece of advice, is recognize that you can still care and you can still do it the right way, but you still need to do what's right for the business at the end of it. And, I think, somebody making that change mid-career, may have those same challenges because, depending on where you've seen HR and what organizations, and, all too often we do still hear is, where's the human in HR? People are forgetting that and forgetting to demonstrate that. And I think that probably over the last 3 years, we've seen a dramatic change in that approach from most HR professionals, because you're trying to balance everything and but recognize, at the end of the day, doing what's right for the organization is what's right for the individual at the end of it. And yes, it's, there are some hard conversations that people have to hear, but sometimes it's for the best for them. So I guess those are the only things I would add to that.
Yeah. We are 10 minutes away from wrapping this conversation up, and I can't believe that almost 1 hour already flew by. And I just want to confirm that this conversation is being recorded. So for everybody who found inspiration in it and you want to re-listen, re-watch, or you just want to recommend it, you can find the recording either directly on our LinkedIn space or on hackinghrlab.io. And there you can also find the recording of one of the panels of yesterday. It was on mindful HR leader. And I loved what one of the panelists said. They said that mindful HR leader sounds like a noun expression, but it's actually a verb. It's a practice and it's a journey. And I get the same feeling from our conversation today that the empathetic HR leader is a journey. So I was tempted to say, what was your biggest learning on this journey? But I will use a spin that I used in previous panels. And I will ask you, what is the biggest unlearning that you had on this journey so far? And I will give you a few seconds to think about it. In the meantime, I will either welcome people who joined late or over the past few minutes, and also thank everybody in the audience for their engagement across the comments. It's really heartwarming to see the energy and the interest that our panel spark. So, biggest unlearning on your journey as an empathetic HR leader. Carol, I see you unmuted.
Yeah. When I think about an unlearning from the empathetic HR leader journey, I had some earlier on in my career, I had some preconceived notions about what empathy was and what it looked like. And I think those preconceived notions really led me down a path that it was something you had or something you didn't have, right? So, to talk about our previous question of, is empathy something that can be learned? That's my learning, and my unlearning. My unlearning is you either have it or you don't. But for me, it really was about understanding all of the different components and skills that went into demonstrating empathy. We talked about active listening. We've talked about, putting yourself in other people's shoes. We've talked about listening to different perspectives. And to me, all of those different components are a part of empathy. And it's not just this thing out there all on its own. And so that piece for me was really about unlearning. It's not just something separate, and it's not something that can't be learned.
Can I just go next? I mean, I think for me, unlearning, I thought of when I first entered my career, which, as you can tell by my gray hair, was a long time ago. I think I thought that being empathetic was a bit of a weakness in the HR role. So I had to, sort of get to the point where I understood what is the empathy and why is it okay, to empathize because, and, understand how that impacted myself, because I think, it was kind of a wall you'd put up so that you don't get hurt, while you're dealing with certain things. And I've dealt with, thousands and thousands of layoffs over the years in different organizations. And I think, what I got to is, demonstrating that empathy and understanding during those moments is actually, is a significant value, just not only from my personal self and understanding, but for the employees that I'm dealing with. So I had to unlearn that, because it felt like when I first started, 30 odd years ago, that, if you were, it was considered unprofessional to be empathetic, in certain environments. But that was for me, my unlearning.
I love both of these. I think you asked this question the other day in a different panel for sure. I can't remember exactly what I said, but I think one thing that a habit of mine I've had to unlearn since coming into the people in HR space, since I haven't always been in this space, is the habit of being overly directive and allowing and encouraging open two-way communication, because in those cases, like, that's where you really build great partnership and great relationships with individuals. That's where you can really learn someone's experience or someone's perspective, to a lot of what Carol was just talking about, how important that is in empathy. And I think those things have allowed me to really build more of an empathetic and inclusive culture on my team, and driving that type of culture inside of our organization. But, I came from a management consulting environment and in the DC area, where it's like sometimes you just had to be directive to be able to move with speed. And there is beauty in slowing down. There is beauty in progress over perfection. And a lot of that comes from being able to give people a voice and empowering and hearing other people's perspectives, because you just learn so much from other individuals and experiences. And again, ultimately, I think that leads to a lot more empathy inside of the workplace.
Absolutely wonderful. Literally minutes away from wrapping day 8 up. But I was thinking whether, as you were preparing for this panel, is there anything that is particularly meaningful to you individually, personally, that we didn't manage to cover under any of the questions so far that you do want to leave our audience with? Again, doesn't have to be a particular slice of the topic, just something that you really want to put out there for inspiration and insight and energy, like a mental hug.
I actually like something that someone in the audience just put in the comments, is having to learn that empathy is not the same as having no boundaries. And I think that is such a great point, Rosie. And definitely something I probably consistently struggle with. Like, often talk about empathy, being empathetic and being sympathetic are two different things. And you are allowed to also stay firm on boundaries and the way something might have to be, even though you are empathetic to what that individual might be going through. Right. And so I think that, like, to Carol's point, like, you want to be in this space. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray you got to work through. But I thought, Rosie, boundary setting in the context of HR is incredibly important.
Yeah, I don't want to lose sight of kind of what Manola kicked us off with, which is, a point of the January series in the panel is really about HR for HR. And I think, oftentimes we get so sucked into, as Deborah's mentioned, doing what's right for the business, helping support and make tough decisions within the organization. But I also think that it's equally important to continually remind ourselves as HR professionals that it is not just important, but it's necessary for us to create empathy within our teams and within each other so that we can be that supportive community. We are taking care of the organization. We need to make sure to take care of ourselves.
Carol, I would agree, and Sarika, the same thing. I mean, I think it is having your own HR community and people that you can go to, because often you're to the side because you're having to be independent and not have any preconceived notions. So you're not involved with a lot of the other employees. So you have to rely on each other and recognizing what that looks like and how each of us can support each other through our journeys, because our teams or your mentor or whoever you might have is such a key part of that journey and making you successful and allowing you to let your guard down and just have those conversations to make yourself more resilient. But that would be what I would add.
And here we are in our last minute. And I was wondering, after 1 hour of talking about being human and showing up authentically, I was wondering if we can wrap this one up. Each of you, one word. How do you feel now at the end of our conversation? How has this conversation made you feel. And I will give you just a couple of seconds. I will thank everybody in the audience for being here. Please also drop in the comments your word about how you feel after our conversation. Also, thank you, Jessa. Wonderful co-hosting with you as always. Thank you, Enrique, for making this happen. One word, how do you feel? Deborah, shall we do this counterclockwise?
Energized.
Thank you so much. Carol?
Grateful.
Great one. Sarika?
I was going to say energized, so I'm going to +1 energized. I love this community.
Wonderful. And I will keep the balance going. I will say +1 to grateful. It was a gift facilitating this conversation. Thank you, everybody. And I hope I will get to see you on my screen very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.